With a robust framework for sticky wages and prices, the new Keynesians had saved the idea of macroeconomic management through sound monetary policy. New Keynesian theory held that monetary shocks were the source of economic instability, which meant that counter-cyclical monetary policy could iron out those shocks. When money demand is high, the Fed can embark on a policy of easy money, meaning increases in the supply of loanable funds and lower interest rates. But when the economy was overheating and inflation was starting to bubble up, the Fed could switch to a policy of tight money, where they slow the growth of the money supply and push interest rates up. Since the channel in which monetary policy impacts the economy is interest rates, they became the focus of the Federal Reserve. In particular, the Federal Reserve began setting a target for the federal funds rate, or the interest rate banks charge each other for short-term loans. Then the Fed uses open market operations to manipulate the federal funds rate until they hit their target. Here's a reminder about how open market operations work. Banks hold deposits and use them to make loans. A significant fraction of the loans they make take the form of buying government bonds, which the federal government issues in order to borrow money to cover a budget deficit. Now, the economy is this big, complicated mess of interactions that are almost impossible to decipher, but the goal is to make sure that people's demand for money is always met and that there is enough cash circulating in the economy to maintain the proper level of aggregate demand. This is the job of the Federal Reserve. When people need more cash, they withdraw from banks. If a bank finds itself in trouble, it will usually borrow from another bank. But if the demand for cash is large enough, then enough money will leave banks to push interest rates up. To maintain their target interest rate, the Federal Reserve will create new money and use it to purchase assets from banks, usually those government bonds. This ensures that the banks will have plenty of cash to lend out and interest rates stay at their targeted levels. But if too much cash makes its way back into the banks, it will push interest rates down, and the economy will begin to overheat and experience inflation. To prevent this from happening, the Fed can sell the assets it bought from the banks in exchange for the cash, and then simply delete the cash. In practice, this usually just means slowing down how much money they create, rather than actually selling off assets. So the question is, what should their target for the federal funds rate be? How do they know when to raise their target interest rate and when to lower it? Remember that Milton Friedman didn't trust the Federal Reserve enough to make that call, because his research had shown them prone to error. But the new Keynesians did not think Friedman's K% rule was sufficient to keep the economy stable. Changes in the money supply needed to be able to adapt to the particulars of the present moment. But acknowledging the potential for human error to wreak havoc on the economy, many agreed that monetary policy should follow a clear rule. The economist John B. Taylor proposed such a rule. It might look like a lot, but it really is quite simple. R is the target rate for the federal funds rate that the Fed should set. It has that little t next to it to indicate that it is the value for R at time t, which is just math for the present time. I represents the current rate of inflation. Notice that it is in two spots in the equation. This Greek letter rho represents the current real interest rate in the economy. U is the current unemployment rate, or in some other versions of the Taylor rule, it is the growth rate in real GDP. And lastly, we have I with an asterisk and U with an asterisk, which each represent the target the Federal Reserve would like to see in the economy for each of those variables. Remember, there's usually a short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment, but the Federal Reserve has a legal mandate to try to keep both of them low. The 0.5 multiplied by the difference between actual inflation and the targeted level of inflation, and the difference between actual unemployment and the targeted level of unemployment, represents an equal weight on the two goals. To make things easy, let's say that the real interest rate in the economy is 0, so we can get rid of rho. The target for inflation is 2%, and the target for unemployment is 6%. Filling in those numbers, we would have this equation. Now we could just look up the statistics for the actual rate of inflation and the actual unemployment rate. Let's say the inflation rate is 3%, higher than our target, and unemployment is 4%, which is lower than our target. Plugging those numbers in, we can solve. The Taylor rule recommends we use open market operations to push the federal funds rate to 4.5%, which would be a pretty tight monetary policy. That makes sense given that inflation is above our target, and we will want to try to calm inflation down with higher interest rates. The Federal Reserve does not explicitly follow the Taylor rule. They conduct monetary policy at their own discretion based on the information they have. However, from around 1987 until 2001, the target for the federal funds rate closely matched the recommendation of the Taylor rule. Whereas in the 1970s, a decade with high inflation, the federal funds rate was much lower than the Taylor rule would recommend, which had to be balanced with high rates in the 1980s to bring inflation back down. The freshwater economists may have been enamored with the real business cycle theory, but these saltwater economists had economic models which made actual forecasts that could be checked against reality, and the experience of the 70s until the turn of the century matched those forecasts. The 20-year period from 1987 to 2007 saw monetary policy under the guidance of new Keynesian ideas, and it was a period of unprecedented economic stability, which has been called the Great Moderation. The U.S. experienced only 2 mild and brief recessions across those 20 years, one in the early 90s and another following 9/11. Contrast this with the 19th century, which saw fresh recessions every couple years, each lasting 3 times as long as these. People looked forward with optimism, and economists wondered if the divergent paths the different schools of thought had, in the end, built a more well-rounded understanding of the economy, and that at long last, the problems of the business cycle had finally been solved.